Clara, thanks very much for making the time to speak with us this afternoon. Give us your sense of what's happened at UCLA in the past sort of 48 hours or so, and what may well happen at colleges and campuses around the country in the next couple of days.
Yeah, so I'm standing here right now in what for the last week was the Palestine Solidarity Encampment. Police moved in the early hours of the morning over here in Los Angeles and arrested the majority of the protesters who refused to leave. Right now, it kind of looks like the aftermath of some epic music festival, but obviously it was very different than that. There's trash out, there's food out, there's still some students and protesters coming to clean up and take things away. I'm hearing echoes of Free Palestine still going on in the background here. The standoff really began last night at around 6 p.m. when the university announced that this was an unlawful gathering and ordered everybody to clear. Students and protesters refused to do so. Then we saw a new influx of 200 to 300 protesters who came to intensify the numbers on campus. And I think that's what perhaps led law enforcement to wait until the early hours of the morning to move in and start this clearing. We've seen similar clearings take place at campuses all across America. 93 students were arrested at USC over here last week. And I think we can expect these crackdowns to continue because these protests certainly aren't showing any sign of stopping.
No, it's interesting you say that, Clara, because I was just speaking to a woman called Ray Weimer she's up at Berkeley, who said that they've had a protest up there for a couple of weeks, very peaceful, and they're actually in discussions with sort of college administrators to discuss the demand. So I suppose it's when the tone changes, when the atmosphere changes as to when the violence begins. Have you been on campus for the past few days, and were you there the other night when it started to get violent?
Yeah, so I didn't witness the attacks on Tuesday evening, but I was here yesterday when the protesters held a press conference and described some of the injuries that they suffered during these attacks. I saw one student show off 12 metal staples on the back of his head when he was whacked by a metal plank. Students had bruises and cuts. From the videos I saw on scene, there were projectiles thrown, fireworks thrown, pepper spray, um, physical objects thrown. It did take a real turn for the violent, and there wasn't adequate safety on campus to keep the students and protesters protected. It really did get quite ugly.
Yeah, and let's just drill into that, Clara, because this is quite important. And we've been watching the pictures of the protests and the line of police for 12 or so hours now. But that moment when the violence began, there were no police on campus, really, were there? There was the local university police, but the LAPD weren't there. And this was violence between the pro-Palestinian groups and its reported pro-Israeli groups who stormed the protest camp.
Yes, it was campus police and some hired security guards, and they really stood back when the violence first started breaking out. LAPD did not arrive on scene till about 1 a.m., and even then they didn't intervene into the conflict until about an hour later. This has led to a really strong criticism of UCLA leadership. Yesterday, Governor Gavin Newsom issued a statement kind of condemning the failure to establish safety here. And Jean Block, the chancellor at UCLA, has said that a thorough investigation will be launched into what went wrong that evening.
Yeah, and Jean Block has been called out by the UCLA paper, the Daily Bruin, for exactly that, for not providing enough support and safety for students. Look, give our viewers a sense, Clara, if you can, of sort of the student body and what it has been like on campus prior to this happening. How long has that protest been there, and when was it decided? What was the sort of sense that we're going to put an encampment there in the quad and begin this protest for Gaza?
Yeah, so the encampment began here a week ago. It was set up the day after 93 arrests at the University of Southern California. And it was kind of mimicking the style of encampment started at Columbia University. And the atmosphere on campus during the encampment has been incredibly tense. It really has felt like a tinderbox, sort of about to go off at any moment. There's an incredible amount of passion from the student protesters who feel so deeply about the cause and the need for an end of the war in Gaza. At the same time, you have some Jewish students on campus speaking out about this pervasive sense of unsafety, protest chants like Intifada now that they feel are a direct threat to Jewish people. But you also have Jewish protesters who were part of this encampment here in student organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace. So a lot of different opinions, a lot of different emotions, but all felt very, very strongly and intensely.
Yeah, and that is what's so sort of challenging to disentangle, isn't it, Clara? Because, as you say, while there was a peaceful protest there for a week or so, you are reporting that there was shouts that Jewish students will have found deeply offensive and worrying to their safety. And then, of course, we saw just the other night the reverse of that, and those pro-Palestinians being attacked by the other side. We've heard from some of the protesters who were involved, and they said that this will be broken up, but that the protest will continue. What's your sense of that? Do you think we could see more of these protests? I mean, I guess the school can't shut down, can it?
No, I mean, UCLA is a public university. This is technically public land. Um, I'm sure students will continue to make their voices heard in protest. I don't know if that'll manifest in another encampment, but certainly from the fervor and the passion I've seen over the past week, there's no way these students are going to stop calling
Mm.
for their demands. They want the university to just close all financial ties, divest from all companies that do business with Israel, sever ties with Israeli universities, and issue a statement calling for an immediate ceasefire. They're going to keep demanding for that. I'm sure of it.
And Clara, do you have any idea of how close in talks the students and student leaders are with the administrators of the university? I guess that things will have reached a bit of an impasse following the encampment and the sort of the violent scenes and the standoff that we saw. But do you know whether or not there is going to be any kind of dialogue between the two sides?
Yes, well, there was ongoing dialogue throughout the time that the encampment was here, and even before then. At the press conference yesterday, students told the media that they were continuing to talk with the university, but they wouldn't disclose any details of how those negotiations were going. So I'm not sure if UCLA was getting close to meeting any of students' demands.
Mm.
I haven't seen other universities stepping up and doing so, but I'm sure student talks will continue with administration because, like I said, this tension is not going anywhere.
No, and Clara, I wonder if you have a thought as to how what we're seeing, what we saw at UCLA, what we're going to be seeing at Berkeley, what we've seen at other campuses around the country, what kind of effect that's having on people and voters specifically across the country. How is what we've seen on campuses, do you think, playing out into the psyche of Americans broadly?
Yeah, well, the Palestine-Israel issue, I think, was always going to be very important in the upcoming November election. And now the amount of media attention and outrage over some of the arrests, I think, will only serve to intensify that.
Mm.
I think it doesn't look excellent for President Biden. Um, I'm not sure that protesters would jump over and vote for Trump because he's very pro-Israel, but I do think you could see a lot of young voters, liberal voters, feeling very dissatisfied with America right now, perhaps not showing up to vote in November, which ultimately could really harm President Biden because he does need sort of every liberal, every Democrat to turn out if he wants to win this election.
Yeah, it's very deftly described, Clara, that it's not going to be great for Biden. We're expecting to hear from him, actually, in the next sort of few minutes or so. Do you think there's anything that he can say at this point that might bring some of those people, some of his sort of maybe natural supporters, back on side? What sort of thing does he need to say at this stage of it? Because got to bear in mind as well, this is just the beginning of the summer. If the protests continue, this could well, there could be another flashpoint.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very hard for President Biden to please protesters right now and placate them because his views and his stance in continuing relations and U.S. military aid to Israel is just so far away from what they are calling for. I mean, obviously, sense of sympathy, sense of sorrow for violence on campus will be appreciated, but I think it would take a real reversal of his policies to make the protesters on the ground here and at other campuses across America feel happy with what he has to say.
And do you think that those protesters have a sense that, if they do, as you say, not turn out come November, that would then bring in a Trump presidency and then, all bets are off in terms of the way that they see the country going forward and the relationship with Israel?
Yeah, so it is a bit of an irony, and that is a pretty true, in my opinion, read of what could happen. Um, but I just feel like the sense of anger against President Biden's response to the war in Gaza has been so strong that students, some protesters who feel like they can't support him no matter what. And I think you saw a similar dynamic play out in the primary in places like Michigan, where people were selecting sort of none of the above on the Democratic ballot for the primary in making a stance of protest against President Biden and his policy in the Israel-Hamas war.
Clara, how much credit and credence do you give to the reporting that instigators have been involved in some of these demonstrations? There's been a lot of reporting that some of those involved are actually not students at all and have come in from outside. We certainly heard that reported from New York when the protest at Columbia was shut down. What's your sense of that being on the ground?
I would definitely say there have been a lot of outsiders on campus, on both sides. I think fellow activists in the Los Angeles community who feel strongly about the Palestinian freedom movement have come on campus to make their voices heard. When it comes to specific instigators of violence, talking about Tuesday night's attacks, I've also heard reports and I've had the students here themselves tell me that there were a lot of adults, people in masks, perhaps part of far right organizations. I've heard the term Proud Boys be thrown around. Obviously, I can't verify any of that. But from some of the smaller skirmishes I've witnessed and the age of people, it's definitely clear that it wasn't just university students present on campus over the last week.
That's really interesting stuff. All right, look, Clara, thank you so much for being with us and really appreciate the reporting. Clara Harter there, thank you for your time. All right, let's bring in our US correspondent, James Matthews, for more on this. James, great